The door closed behind him with a sound that was too ordinary for what it carried. It clicked like any door, and his shoes scuffed briefly on linoleum as he left. He turned, looked at me, and said, 3 months. The words filled the room first as sound, then as weather. The fluorescent lights seemed to dim, not because they lost power, but because something inside me had. Air paused in my chest. My hands went numb, not with cold, but with the sudden irrelevance of everything they had been doing. I remember the smell, antiseptic, the faint perfume of a nurse who was already at another doorway. The world narrowed to the sound of him saying it again, as if to make sure I heard. 3 months. I had imagined the ritual of a diagnosis in worse ways. I had not imagined the speed with which life would reorganize around one sentence. My legs failed me, and I sat before I could think to. It was a small chair in a small room where they give bad news with protocol and a plastic cup of water. He wrote something on a pad, slid it toward me, and then left. The door clicked the same way. The room was suddenly too bright, too white, too small. I didn't cry at first. Crying seemed like an action for another person, for someone who could still plan the way they would betray the future. Instead, I counted. My breaths, the tiles under my feet, the number of stitches in the seam of my sleeve. I counted until the body understood that the mind had been arrested. On the way out, I passed a trash can in the corridor. The metal kind hospitals keep for magazines and coffee cups. Something dark against the crumpled paper caught my eye. A slip, folded and hurried. I stooped because doing something small felt like an act of defiance. The name on it was unmistakable. Mine. They had printed it too neat and impersonal. Helena. On the back, someone had scrawled 3 words. She must not know. I remember the cold that rushed up my spine. I remember thinking, absurdly, that the paper might have been intended as a joke. Then I remembered the pad the doctor had slid across. Then I imagined the closed doors and the soft confidence with which people in white coats speak for other people's lives. The corridor's hum became menace. I kept the scrap folded in my palm like contraband. I left the hospital slower than when I arrived, as if each step outward risked revealing a truth I wasn't ready for. People in the waiting room watched me with polite concern. A husband held his wife's hand a little tighter. A child was given a lollipop. The ordinary continued as if the universe had not split. If this story matters to you, subscribe. It helps keep these stories alive. The phone felt heavier than it should have in my bag. I called the clinic from my car in the parking lot because that seemed civilized. Ask questions, hear rational answers. The woman who answered was friendly, trained. I said my name and the date. I asked for clarification. She gave me a procedure number and a promise that someone would call back. The line clicked. Then it clicked again, and a recorded voice told me the number was not recognized. I called back. This time, a static-laced tone, the kind you get when someone inside a building decides not to answer. And finally, the line cut. I sat in my car and watched the clinic's sliding doors breathe in and out with people like a living thing. I folded the scrap of paper, opened it again. She must not know. The words read like an order. They read like an explanation. When I came home, the house smelled like the life we had built. Coffee, old books, the faint lemon of a cleaner Ricardo liked. Ricardo had died 2 years earlier. He had been an inconveniently thorough man in life, a tax auditor who never believed that a loose end could be left. After his funeral, I always found small proofs of his habits. A receipt folded and tucked into a cookbook, a schedule with margins full of questions he hadn't had time to ask. Grief settles into the corners that busy hands leave behind. I had been careful not to touch the office he left, fearful or reverent. Now, with my own clock worded by a stranger, his office felt less like a shrine and more like a safe. I went to the desk. The drawer resisted at first, like it always had, then gave. There was the stack of reports he used to keep, financial statements, a notebook in his hand, an old Polaroid with sunspots where the negatives had aged. Beneath the notebook, wrapped in a shirt he'd worn on a cold day, was an envelope addressed to me in his handwriting. The top was sealed with the kind of slow, formal patience Rick had always had. On the outside, in the corner, someone, he, perhaps, had written, small and urgent, "If something happens." I sat down at the kitchen table and slid a knife under the envelope's flap, like someone operating on a memory. The letter inside was folded twice. It smelled faintly of his aftershave. It did not begin with the usual little domesticities. He had written it long before that day. A man anticipating contingencies. A man who had grown to understand the conveniences of preemptive care. He did not accuse in the letter. He begged and he guided. He explained that he'd been looking into a pattern, a set of clinics, a way of writing toward an outcome, and that the further he dug, the more the same names and the same neat handwriting appeared. He understood in a way that made me see his sleeplessness again, that some people saw profit in announcement. He asked me to trust the box under the false bottom of his wardrobe if anything happened. There were no exact instructions in his words, only a map of intention and a sentence I have kept folded inside me. Run if you must, but take the proof. The letter did not use accusing names. It used guilt as a tool to move me. Ricardo asking me to live. Read that way, it was less a legal lead and more a love note against a slow erasure. Under the wardrobe, beneath a row of sweaters, there was a shallow shoebox tied with twine. Inside, as he promised, a collection. Copies of invoices, a battered pen drive with a label in his handwriting. If something happens to me, and a sheaf of folded medical reports with handwriting that did not belong to any treating physician I trusted. The reports were stamped and counter-stamped. They wore the polish of officialdom. Yet some lines were typed in ways that read like fiction, assessments that leapt from manageable to terminal with the speed of an elevator. For a long time I sat with the box on my lap, the room closing around it, the past and future exceeding the walls. Ricardo had been dead 2 years, but his voice circled in the cadence of the paper. Check the receipts, check the transfers, look for the pattern. The pen drive felt warm in my hand, as if someone had only recently touched it. When I pressed the plug into my laptop in the kitchen, a small file name blinked on the screen. Ambar Directives. I froze. The letters stayed there like a stone. Amber, or Ambar, had been a code name Ricardo had circled in his notebook. He'd seen it twice in unrelated invoices. He had followed it to a name in the back of a pharmaceutical brochure. Now it sat on my screen, as if it had been waiting, at the clinic again. Curiosity did something to me that fear couldn't. I told myself I was only confirming what I already feared. That rationalization was a fence. I climbed it. I walked in under the pretense of a follow-up appointment and found the reception area humming with its usual small dramas. A woman arguing about an appointment time. A young man with a hoodie staring at his phone. The receptionist's desk was a hive of bright plastic. Her monitor faced the room like a confession. I stood far enough away not to be suspicious, near a stack of pamphlets about diet and heart health, and watched as a cursor blinked on the screen. The window that had been open when she leaned away displayed a folder name with an underline, Ambar Directrices. Beneath it a list of patients scrolled through. My name, Helena, had been attached to a tag, Stage 2, Psychological Preparation. I felt as if the ground beneath me was tilting. Stage 2, Psychological Preparation? The language sounded bureaucratic, like a program designed by people who reduce lives to steps. I paid attention to the receptionist when she returned, because I had to know that I had not read the words wrong. She chatted with a colleague, laughed briefly about a television show. The cursor blinked again. The tag had not changed. I had no right to be in that space. I had no credentials, no authority. I was only a woman who had been told she had months and who had read a scrap of paper in a trash can. Still, the evidence lined up like tracks in snow. As I turned to leave, a man at the end of the counter, leaning in the doorway to watch the sliding doors, let his eyes find mine and hold them. He was neither young nor old. His face was the type that holds attention by not demanding it, plain, with a jaw softened by time. His hand found the strap of his bag like an old gesture. He said my name, because in the kind of small town we had become after years in the same place, people still knew each other's names. "You're Helena," he said, not as a question. "Yes," I said, and my voice surprised me by being steady. His name was Vicente, he told me later. He said he had known Ricardo through work, a friend who helped when men left too many loose ends behind. He did not offer himself like a hero. He simply stood there, an anchor. The way he moved suggested he had done unglamorous things before, and preferred that nothing be dramatic about them now. When someone else stepped away from the desk, he leaned in, not to overhear but to make sure his hand covered the space. He did not ask to see my records. Instead, he said quietly, "You should not believe them." Those 5 words dismantled the last of my rational scaffolding. I felt anger and an absurd, fierce shame for having believed. An older woman in the chairs looked up, concerned. I must have looked a mess because Vicente guided me to a small side room where coffee machines hummed and old magazines lay untouched. He sat across from me and spoke in the cadence of someone who had said these sentences too often in his life. Slow, earnest, weighted. "Ambar is not a treatment," he said. "It's a design." He spoke about processes with a dry clarity that made my skin go hot. He told me that sometimes systems create outcomes for profit, and that there are ways to mark a life for extraction. A diagnosis, a recommendation, a paper trail that becomes proof for a payout. He called it not just fraud, but a program, coordinated agreements between clinics, auditors, insurance, threads that made a net. "They call it Ambar because it sounds harmless," he said. "A name, a project, but names hide things." He slid a copy of something across the table, polite as a man offering a card. It was not printed but photocopied. Headers and footers, numbers in a column, a stamped date that meant nothing to a layperson until you stared long enough and noticed the same account number repeated. Small transfers like a spider web. There were notes in the margin. Psychological preparation, stage 2, words that matched what I had seen on the receptionist's screen. "You should get out of there," he said. "Go home. Don't go alone. Take it slow." I wanted to ask him who financed it, who signed the papers, which banks carried the names. I wanted to ask the obvious questions that would make it feel like a mystery novel and not a lived calamity. Instead, I asked the one question that mattered. Had he seen my name on more than one list? He only nodded. When I went home that afternoon, the house felt altered. The living room light seemed to have the wrong angle. Ricardo's photos looked like wooden props. I locked the door out of habit and then unlocked it again, because I could not trust that my own instincts were rational. I told myself I was being paranoid. Vicente's words clung to me because they were not dramatic. They were procedural. He painted in the color of process, and process is scarier because it implies intention. Marcelo came that night like an answer I had not asked for. He had always been the kind of son who arrived with a new idea threaded into his expression, a kind of optimism that sometimes felt like a refusal to see what was ugly. I had always believed, in the way mothers do, that love could neutralize poor decisions. He had thin shoulders and the hands of a man who had turned to work too early in his life. He embraced me like a man who knew how to be small in public and tender in private. "You said it yourself," he said, after we sat with coffee that had gone cold. "You always said if the worst came, we would handle it together." I wanted to tell him to leave. Part of me wanted proof, and part of me wanted his presence like a talisman. He said he had read the doctor's notes online. He said he had called too, and that the office had been kind. He insisted the best thing was to trust the people in white coats, to follow the plan, to accept home care. Later, when the house was quiet and I tried to sleep, I pictured him at the clinic sliding into the waiting room as if a costume had been put on for him. Something in the way the receptionist's eyes had glanced toward him when he had walked in was the same glance I had seen once before, the quick recognition of someone who belongs to a ledger. I pushed the thought away. It made me meaner than I liked to be. Ricardo's box was small and heavy. I had hidden it behind a false bottom and told myself I would not move it unless I had to. At 4 a.m, hearing noises in the corridor like furniture settling, I got up and opened it again. The pen drive sat in a little sleeve, blue and scuffed. I plugged it in and watched the files open like a private universe. There were lists, names, numbers, and small scanned letters that looked official, stamped with clinic logos. There was one file named with a patient number I recognized because I had seen it on my own chart. It had been flagged, urgent. Under it, a line read, "Proceed to Stage 2. Another file was a spreadsheet with transfer dates. There were narrative reports with phrases that read like contextual statements. Family informed. No known objection. Psychological conditioning recommended. The language was careful and final. I printed everything I could carry and folded the paper into a thin pack. The printer's small fan clicked like an old clock. I placed the copies in the shoebox with the pen drive and wrapped it back in the same twine Ricardo had tied. The house felt like a bank vault with a crying baby inside. The next morning I went back to the clinic before the city warmed into full noise. I told myself I was going to ask, to read, to make the reality of it less like an accusation and more like an answer. I walked with my head down, the box under my coat, the weight of the paper inside like a platelet of iron. Inside, the fluorescent lights were merciless. The receptionist's monitor blinked and then something moved in the admin office. A man who brushed past a doorway and into a short hallway. I felt eyes find me, not because I wanted attention, but because something in my stride had shifted. The man in the hallway, I did not meet him before I heard his name. He came out and his hands were quick, like a man used to moving things where they needed to be. He asked if I needed help and offered directions the way someone in a place of service does. I watched him through the glass door as he disappeared into the back room. I had the box in my lap when Vicente found me again, this time with a small, tight smile that did not reach his eyes. Behind him he carried another folder. He looked like someone who had once been part of systems and now used his knowledge to observe them. He squeezed my hand, and in that gesture, I felt the gravity of the next steps. "We can't be here," he said. "Not now." His voice was urgent but controlled. We moved toward the door together. The clinic had a back corridor leading to an administrative section, a place where papers moved like breath through an institution. Vicente opened a side door and slipped inside. I hesitated, the box heavy against my hip, then followed. Something in the way the corridor swallowed sound made my skin go taut. Inside the administrative room, I saw papers nailed to a board, the way a detective pins clues. A laptop lay open, asleep. On a shelf, a small stack of patient files. For a moment, I felt like a thief. The box in my hands, the proofs in my lap. Vicente's face was close to the screen, squinting, tracing lines. He pointed at a name, and then at a transfer number, and then at a column that meant nothing until it meant everything. His finger tapped the desk, a small percussion. "This is not a mistake," he whispered. "This is design." Then the door burst. I don't mean it opened politely. It was pushed so hard the handle hit the metal strip at the bottom of the door. Voices came behind it, too many to account for. Boots on tile, a brief flurry of steps. A light flashed in my peripheral vision. Sunlight caught an object I could not see, like a camera or a wrist. For a second I thought they were there for me, the people who wanted me quieted. The instinct to run is not a noble thing. It is a movement of animal logic when the world tilts toward threat. Vicente moved before my thought finished its sentence. He grabbed my arm with the kind of confidence I have seen in men who have saved others without ever being praised. He shoved the box toward the cabinet and shoved me toward the window. "Hide," he said. His voice was a dagger. I ducked into a closet because that was the closest refuge, folding my body into the dark like a secret. My breath was loud in my own ears. Boots scuffed by. A silhouette passed the closet door. The man outside spoke quickly in a voice I did not want to identify. Paper rustled. Keys turned. For a minute the whole world was the clench in my throat, and the sound of a man clearing his throat somewhere in the room. Then footsteps stopped. A shadow passed the closet. I held myself still, as if stillness could be a cloak. The door handle moved, and the closet door opened in the wrong direction, a hand reaching in. There was noise, Vicente's voice, sharper than before, a rough sound as of negotiation. A hand closed over the edge of the cabinet. There was no room in the closet to see, but I heard the low proof of a struggle. A chair scraped, a muffled oath. I thought absurdly that if I could press harder against my own stillness, I might become weightless and therefore invisible. I heard a muffled sound like a chair hitting the floor, and the gruff command of someone used to getting what they wanted. Then Vicente's voice, 2 notes of defiance, and a sound that imitated impact. I pressed my palm to my mouth to stop a sound from escaping. The door to the closet opened a fraction, and there, in the threshold, a blur of movement. 2 men bracing, one dragging a person who had been on his feet into limbo. Vicente's coat was askew, his hat missing, and at his side, a man I did not know had hold of him. They moved like a choreography. One man grabbing Vicente's arm, another securing his wrist. A quick cuff, practiced and impersonal. Someone barked an order. Then they turned their attention to my hiding place. I felt the light of a phone as someone shone it into the dark, and my own face became visible to them like a flash photograph. "Helena." The voice was careful, then rougher. "You have to come out." I stood because there was nowhere to go, and the box sat idle under the desk like a secret waiting for someone to open it. My legs were not steady. The men took my hands, not with gentleness but with a rough efficiency that meant their job was to secure, to contain. One of them, I recognized his face now, not by name but by the flatness of his eyes, moved toward the desk with an appetite. "Where is it?" he asked. "Where did he hide it?" I had never felt smaller. The room closed in around me. I opened my mouth and said what came with the rawest honesty I could summon. "I don't know." It was true in the sense that I had not told them anything. It was a lie in the sense that truth had been inside my coat the whole time. Panic is a poor editor of strategies. They moved through the room with the self-assurance of people who work with the logic of property. They were not violent in the cinematic sense, but they were thorough. One of them, the man with the sharp jaw, went for the cabinet and pulled drawers, flipping papers with the practiced hand of someone who had read many closets and assumed they would find the same thing. His fingers paused on a folded sweater, and then with a quick motion, opened the false bottom of a wardrobe, like someone who practiced this privately. He found the shoebox. His face did not change. He looked at the box like a man who found his name in a ledger. Then he looked up at me. "You should not have taken it," he said, and I had the stupid, crystalline thought that this was the exact sentence I had found scrawled on a scrap of paper in a trash can. I moved, not because I planned, but because the instinct to save what matters has a speed of its own. I lunged for the box. Everything became a series of small, sharp images. The man's hand on my wrist, the throb behind my left ear, the box slipping from my fingers, Vicente stumbling as two of them forced him down. There was a brief metallic sting on my palm as my wedding band scraped on the lid. The box hit the floor with a sound that made the air seem brittle. Someone, a different voice, higher and faster, shouted. There was a cough of movement, and then the world narrowed to the single fact that Vicente had been taken. I saw the lines of his shoulders bend as they pulled him toward the door, a human rope being hauled into silence. He looked at me as if he wanted to say something fierce, and instead he gave me a look like a man giving me a tool. "Take care." Then they were gone. I was left in the center of a room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and adrenaline, my hands empty, my chest raw. The box sat where it had fallen, its twine unfurled, the paper inside breathing like a living thing. The men had not taken everything. They had only taken the man who had been in the way. Outside, the city carried on. Footsteps, the minor grievances of mourning. Inside, my own life had been rearranged with the blunt tool of presence and absence. Vicente did not come back. I picked up the box with shaking hands and felt the absence settle in a new place. The paper inside crinkled with the small score of movement. I wrapped it up and slipped it under my coat, the same way one hides a contraband heart. The clinic's exit doors breathed in and out with the flow of people, and I moved through them like someone wearing a costume of normalcy. I had to get away before more of them returned. I ran into the cold air because it felt less collusive than lingering. The cold slapped my face, and I tried to put distance between me and the men with brief strides that felt clumsy and ineffectual. I had expected sirens. I had expected chaos. I had expected my son to leap to my defense. What arrived was nothing but the ordinary noise of life, a delivery truck backing up, an ambulance lights off at the curb, a dog walker with a cigarette. I walked until my legs could no longer think of pace, and found myself across the street in a narrow park I had not noticed before, a strip of green between the clinic and a strip mall. A bench waited like a thinking place, where one goes to take stock. I sat and opened the shoebox. The pen drive smiled like an accusation. The papers I had printed were there, slightly rumpled. The file names on the drive were clear in my head. Ambar directives, patient lists, Stage 2 psychological notes. There was a small legal pad in the box with Ricardo's handwriting in the margins, phrases underlined like a man who had circled what mattered. I cried then, a small soft thing, not because I was weak, but because the body needs to release what the mind has banked. My hands shook in the cold and my breath fogged. I thought of Ricardo in the way one thinks of postcards from the dead, places frozen in a time you cannot reach again. I thought of Vicente being hauled away in a way that made me feel like a bad thing had just been postponed. What they had taken from me was not only a man with a coat and a camera of evidence. They had taken a moment in which someone else had stood between me and a danger I had not known. That absence was a ledger I did not want to tally, but I wrote down an accounting in my head. Fear multiplied, allies captured, time stolen. At dawn, the city is a different creature. The streetlights blinked out, and a pale, slow wash of light came over the buildings like a promise that had been postponed, but not denied. I sat on that bench and looked at the way morning softened edges. I folded the paper, slid the pen drive into my pocket, and decided with a sudden, hard clarity that I would not put the shoebox back under Ricardo's sweater to gather dust as a memory. There was too much at stake for sentiment. The impulse to act is not the same as clarity. I was not heroic. I was frightened and tired and increasingly furious. But somewhere between the trash can and the bench, I had become a woman willing to risk being wrong rather than stay quiet and be used. The word Ricardo had once written, "Run if you must, but take the proof," had moved from a sentence to a command. I had the box. I had evidence. And I had the memory of Vicente's eyes as they told me, without saying it, to keep going. I stood up because the bench was a place for consideration, not for retreat. The city smelled like wet pavement and coffee now. I put one foot in front of the other and walked away, the shoebox tucked under my coat, an ordinary thing carrying the shape of extraordinary danger. I did not yet know who I would call. I did not know whether Marcelo would be friend or calculation. I did not know if the men who had taken Vicente would come back looking for paper. What I knew was this: whatever time they had offered me as a sentence, I would not spend it waiting to be erased. I would spend it making sure the erasure was documented. Behind me, the clinic's doors moved as people passed. In a room inside, men had held a man they wanted out of the way and taken him to a place where people like Vicente disappear for a while. I could not tell whether they had done it for money, or habit, or fear. But I had seen the file on the screen. I had read the notes. I had felt the hurts and the waiting morph into a kind of hunger for action. So I walked. I kept the shoebox close to my chest like a small animal. The city opened with all its indifferent sensory details. A baker lifting loaves, a cyclist yelling at traffic, the soft murmur of a couple arguing about nothing at all. I understood then, with a clarity that made my vision steady, what I had wasted. It was not merely years. It was not merely trust. It was the long, slow habit of assuming I was safe because I had been careful. It was the way I had deferred living, waiting to be healed, waiting to be fixed, letting the minutes slide by, while others made decisions on my behalf. I had given away the hours I might have used to love more openly, to test edges, to say the things I meant to say. They had taken my safety, and, in return, revealed the ledger of my life. I kept walking because movement felt less culpable than staying. The shoebox under my coat was both evidence and a compass. I did not yet know the path it would send me down, but I knew I could not stand idle while others wrote the story of my ending. Around me, the city warmed to morning, and the day began to insist on ordinary things. The fight, when it found me, would be noisy and messy and human. I understood with a quiet kind of fury that the waste had been mine as much as anyone's. The time I had spent trusting arrangements rather than questioning them. The hours I had surrendered to comfort. The moments I had not asked the harder questions. I kept my steps even and my face calm. The shoebox was heavy with paper and a small blue drive that might as well have been a key. I had money, photographs, copies, and a single terrible advantage. Someone had told me what they were doing, and I had listened. The day brightened into a promise that it might not fulfill. Somewhere behind the clinic, inside fluorescent rooms, men were already making plans that would attempt to render us small. I had no illusions. I did not think it would be simple or fast. I only had a determination as stubborn as a bruise to make what they tried to erase visible. I tucked the shoebox tighter, feeling the weight of possibility in my arms, and began to walk toward the only place I could imagine going next. I kept walking toward the only place I could imagine going next. It was a small diner at the corner of two streets that smelled like frying oil and old coffee. Katerina liked corners that had both light and noise. She said it made people honest. When I pushed the door open, the bell above it sang a note that felt like a confirmation. She was already there, hands wrapped around a mug, a notebook open, but unread. Up close, she looked smaller than I expected, hair shot with silver, the same quickness in her eyes I had seen in old footage of reporters who never let a story die. She did not waste a minute on pleasantries. She stood when she saw me and reached out the way hands do when they want to steady another person. "I thought you might come," she said. Her voice was a low instrument that meant business. She glanced at the box but did not make a show of it. There was a light in her eyes that was part curiosity, part consolation. I sat and set the shoebox on the formica between us like a small confession. The waitress refilled Katerina's coffee. The clink of cups tried to make us ordinary. "You look like someone who's been through a windstorm," Katerina said. She did not try to hide the fact that she had read something about ambar before. Small mentions, rumors on a chain, but not much. She unfolded a pen and clicked it twice. "Tell me everything." I told her, starting with the door, the word, the scrap of paper in the trash can, and finishing with Vicente dragged down a hallway. I went slow where it mattered, because the details were the currency that moved people into action. I handed her the pen drive and the papers. Her fingers were quick and exact. She did not look at me with pity. She opened the box with the kind of respect that made me think of funeral directors unwrapping things in a steady way. She read for a long time. The diner blurred around me. Plates banged, a couple laughed at a joke, someone called an order for fries, and between those sounds I heard the rhythm of a woman counting proof like notes in a ledger. When she finally looked up, she said only two things. "This is the real thing, and we have to move carefully." She called a colleague who worked at a national outlet. Not the sensational kind. This was someone who knew how to take a file and make it matter without making promises. She also called a contact who had once worked in a court, and who, though no longer a judge, still had friends on the bench. The names and numbers she used were not magic words but tools. What mattered was that she had the will to use them. I asked how she would publish. She explained, in a way that was nothing like a how-to and everything like a reassurance, that she would put the documents in front of people who could not ignore them, editors who wanted verifiable lines, journalists who would corroborate, and who understood the slowness of legal process. She promised me transparency. Names would be redacted where necessary, dates checked twice, sources protected. She did not promise instant justice. She promised that light would move where I could not. We left the diner as a team, two women running files by weight. Katerina tucked copies into manila envelopes, labeled them in a careful hand, and made a list of people to contact. She took photographs of certain pages with the bluntness of someone documenting evidence. I watched her work like a person watching a surgeon. There was no drama in her movements, only the patient machinery of someone who had built channels before and had learned patience as a craft. She asked if I wanted to go to the police. I thought of Vicente still breathing on the floor of a back room, of men with flat eyes rifling through closets, and I said no at first. Not because I did not trust a badge, but because I had seen how systems protect themselves. She accepted my hesitancy without judgment and suggested another route, a preliminary leak to a trusted editor and to a court contact who could at least file a notice that would make moving the files a matter of record. At night, she took the pen drive to a place where she could make copies without being watched and returned with a stack of CDs and a small printed pack that smelled of ink. She moved like a woman performing a private ritual. Copy, verify, protect. I rode with her in her car while she made calls and left messages. At one point, she stopped the vehicle, turned to me and said, "They will come for the box. They will try to get it back. You need a plan that is visible." "I already have a plan," I said. "And I need you to trust it," she answered, not unkindly. That afternoon was an inversion of the morning. Instead of shame, I felt a heat in my chest that was close to anger. The files began to move. A journalist I did not know called me and asked questions about timing, about names, about how Ricardo had described the pattern. Someone at a law office called to say they had received an anonymous packet that matched the documents I'd shared. A voice with the cadence of slow judgment said they would review and advise. My phone kept buzzing in a muted constellation of alerts. Everything we did rashly was measured. Katerina organized meetings in crowded places that made it harder for watchers to trace us, but she declined to be theatrical about it. She said the opposition would not be theatrical either. Dr. Alvaro would not come with trumpets and a billboard. He would come with lists, with men who had keys, and with the practiced coldness of someone who had spent a lifetime moving things from one ledger to another. He would not do it in public. Of course he did not. That evening, when the city had folded itself into long lamplight, I returned to the house because it was still mine, in the sense that grief had made it the only place I remembered being myself. Marcelo was there when I opened the door. He did not look like a man who could hold his head up against the world. His clothes were the same ones he always favored, practical, neutral, like a man trying to be invisible. He said nothing at first. In the kitchen we made tea in silence that was too loaded to be comfortable. He told me then, halting, the first of many confessions. He said that debt had been like water in his throat. He said that the men had given him a name and a number, that they had told him a way to make money fast, to pay off what he owed so we could breathe. He spoke of threats that were small in their words but enormous in their meaning. Late-night calls, demands for access, hints about what would happen if he refused. He had wanted to protect me, he said. Instead, he'd been told to get close, to be useful. You were scared, I said. The truth landed with the softness of an answered prayer and the harshness of a slap. I was, he said. His hands trembled. For a moment he looked like the boy who had once pressed his face against my shoulder when a storm rattled the windows. The admission did not erase the damage. It did not turn the ledger to zero. But it held the complexity of human being, not wholly traitor, not wholly victim. He had chosen what he thought would be the smallest harm for the greatest good. It had not worked that way. There was a knock at the door then, a purposeful, sustained knock. The kind you do when you expect someone to open because you intend to do something you cannot undo. Marcelo looked at me with a confusion I could not fix. I moved to the window and peered through the curtain. Outside on the stoop stood a man I knew by sight from the clinic hallways, one of those efficient faces that always looked like they were balancing a ledger. The door opened before I decided anything. The man stepped in with two others, and behind them walked Dr. Alvaro himself, coat buttoned, voice soft like paper. He looked at my living room as if it were an office he had come to audit. "Helena," he said with a smile that did not reach his eyes. There was a civility to his tone that was more dangerous than rage. It was the tone people used when they dismissed another's humanity. "We need to talk about the box." Marcelo moved as if to place himself in front of me. I went to a shelf where a lamp sat and made a small, useless movement like straightening something. The room smelled like old lemon cleaner and fear. "You need to hand it over," Alvaro said. He was close enough to see the scar at my knuckle from a time I had chopped too quickly a vegetable years before. He laughed lightly, the way someone laughs at an unfortunate insect. "You don't understand how this looks." "What looks?" I asked. The words were small, bright, leaned like a wire. "What looks?" He tilted his head. "You making accusations that could ruin reputations. You walking around with documents of irregularities." His eyes flicked to Marcelo in a way that made my blood run cold. "You could make mistakes that harm people." Marcelo swallowed. He looked as if someone had carved gaps into him and then left him to bleed in a hallway. Everything he had been trying to manage was now a public thing in a living room like mine. My son's grief and shame were a kind of violence I couldn't remedy. "You threatened him," I said. It came out taut and then loose. Words have a force of their own when the heart insists. Alvaro's smile did not falter. "We offer people options," he said. He used the language of systems, of benefit and plan. It was the rhetoric I had seen on the receptionist's screen and the margins of Ricardo's copies. He reached out with just a small gesture. For a moment it seemed he expected me to accept the exchange. I moved instead. I had the shoebox in my bag still. I took it out and set it on the coffee table between us like a prize or a provocation. He did not touch it. Men like him have the advantage of assuming you will fear them into cooperation. I found that I did not. "This box goes where it belongs," I said. My voice sounded like a sound I did not always recognize. Clipped, clear. "It goes to people who can check it." "What if it causes panic?" Alvaro asked. "What if lives are ruined by rumors?" "You have already decided who dies quietly," I said. The sentence surprised me with its honesty. I saw in his eyes a flicker of anger, which confirmed what I had suspected. His ease was not innocence, but calculation. He stepped forward then, the edges of civility pulling into something else. One of his men moved toward the table. There was a hand on Marcelo's shoulder, not quite a grip, more like the reminder that he was still an asset to be used. The room contracted to the size of a fist. I thought very quickly of the time Vicente had pushed me toward the window and said, "Hide." I thought of the bench in the early morning, where I had promised myself I would not let them write my end. I thought of Ricardo's letter, tucking its underlined phrases into me like armor. If they were going to take the box by force, they would have to do it in front of witnesses. So I did something I had not planned. I pulled my phone out and dialed a number I had promised myself I would not use unless everything else failed. It was Catarina's number. The man nearest me, Alvaro's, saw me move and lunged. His hand clipped my wrist, hard, but I slid the phone into my palm as if it were a relic. I pressed the call into speaker. Catarina answered in 3 rings. Her voice was immediate. "Where are you?" "In my living room," I said. I said it plainly because the truth held like a light. "Dr. Alvaro is here." She was on the line like a switch flipping. A second voice I didn't recognize said, "We're on our way." Then a noise, the sound of chairs scraping the floor, and then the soft percussive cadence of shoes. They were coming. Catarina had called people who moved faster than systems. She had friends who could get into places and make noise without making a show. I had no illusions about what would happen next, but the balance had shifted just enough. Alvaro's men tightened their faces. He looked at me like someone disappointed that the chessboard had a new piece. "You will regret this," he said in a voice that tried to promise consequence without telling the time. Marcelo, suddenly small and brittle, said, "I'll go with them." He stood as if to leave, as if he could become a sacrifice. Alvaro's hand closed on him like a contract. That was when the first sound came. Not sirens, but the low, insistent engine of a van outside, and the heavy footfall of people who were not afraid of doors. Through the open window, I saw flashlights move like fish in dark water. Men who had once seemed so inescapable from a hospital corridor now looked like men who had been called out into daylight. There was a scuffle. One of Alvaro's men made a move that might have been a shove or a grab. A figure in the doorway, a reporter from Catarina's team, shouted something I couldn't make out but which had the effect of disrupting a practiced flow. Another voice, different in tone, barked questions. "Is everyone okay? Police?" Alvaro's jaw tightened. He glanced at Marcelo, as if weighing options. He cantered on a small moral calculus that made his face thinner. Then, with a coldness that felt like a blade, he stepped back. "You haven't seen the last of us," he said. He left with the same civility he'd arrived with, like a man leaving a theater after a disappointing performance. They did not take the box. When they were gone, the room was a kind of wreckage. Marcello slumped into a chair like someone whose vertebrae had been turned to sand. I was shaking in a way that belonged to a different age. Katerina's people were there now, moving still, taking notes, photographing fingerprints left on the box for the improbable but necessary record. A man who said he was an investigator for a newspaper asked me my name twice and wrote it with the terrible neatness of someone who had learned not to trust memory. Vicente was not among them. That absence tasted like metal. By midnight we had moved the most important copies to trusted hands, and Katerina had arranged a pattern of visibility. A story would run the next morning, with enough evidence laid out that the public could not simply glance away. She had also left a copy with a prosecutor she trusted, someone who had been on the bench when Ricardo had once argued a financial case with a kind of precision that made people uncomfortable. I thought of Ricardo then, the way he had tucked ears into margins. For a moment, I let myself imagine him reading the headlines we would soon make, nodding with that small, satisfied expression he used when a math problem solved itself. We didn't sleep much. I sat in the kitchen while they coordinated, and I felt the odd sensation of having made a decision that felt as if it had always been there, waiting to leap out of me. Katerina's team left around 2 a.m, a constellation of cars that carried evidence and courage. Before they left, Katerina pressed a paper into my hand and said, "If anything happens to me, promise me you will go public." She smiled in a way that made it clear that she meant both her safety and mine. I promised because my word suddenly seemed like a binding thing, not easy, but necessary. The sun came up on a day that felt like someone had scrubbed the sky. The story hit mid-morning. The headline did not scream. It stated with a clinical accuracy that documents pointed to a coordinated program named AMBAR, and that several clinics had records indicating an unusual pattern of diagnoses and transfers to certain funds. The paper laid out timelines and photographs of printouts. The stocks of the clinic's parent company, if such things existed, did not concern me. What mattered was that people recognized the pattern I had carried under my coat like an accusation. Calls came in. Some were gentle, some were abrupt. A detective who had read the story called and asked for a meeting. A journalist from a rival outlet wanted to know if they could confirm what we had. My phone would not stop buzzing. For the first time since the door had closed and the word 3 months had rearranged my life, I felt a movement that was not a retreat. The world was answering in its own ungainly way. Then the call I had dreaded. Vicente's friend calling from a hospital 40 minutes away. They had found him in a motel with bruises like small apologies. He was alive. Hearing the word alive felt like someone placing their palm against the part of a clock that refuses to stop. When I reached him, his voice was a break. He said nothing of heroics. He said he had been taken to a back room, that they had beaten him for being inconvenient, for asking questions. He told me he had been hidden in a place a man goes to when he is of no further use. He said, with the grace of someone saving dignity, that he had been able to slip a note to a nurse who was not entirely mercenary. "They were sloppy," he whispered, "or someone wanted us seen." We did not know who had done what. It was clear, though, that once papers became public, the people who could not afford a scandal would feel it like a stone in their shoe. Vicente's rescue, if it could be called that, came from the press and a hospital intake nurse who recognized him from a photograph. People moved because they were embarrassed to be found out. Justice, when it moves, often moves for reasons that are pedestrian. Vicente arrived at the hospital with one eye swollen and a silence that had weight. For a long time he would not speak except in clarifying notes. He sat with us in a small cafeteria and folded his hands like a man learning how to hold himself again. He told us what he knew. Names, dates, the way transfers had been described in clean terms. He gave us details that only someone who had seen the ledger could see. Katerina took it down like a scribe. The information tilted toward clarity. Marcelo surrendered 2 days later. He called me before and asked if I would meet him at a station. The look on his face when I saw him was not of a man expecting punishment, but a man expecting judgment. He had dark circles under his eyes and a beard he had not had the week before. He looked older than he had any right to. He stepped forward with a thin stack of documents and a small explanation that made him both smaller and more real. He said he had been paid to log visits and to let certain people in. He said he had been told if he refused, someone he cared about would be hurt. He did not try to decorate his choices with excuses. He offered them like an inventory. The officers took his statement. They did not attack him with words. They walked him through legalities, recording what he knew. There was a prosecutor who listened with a gentleness that made me think of a teacher asking a child to speak truth. Marcelo's voice broke when he mentioned price, and when he mentioned the times he had thought he was keeping us safe by being useful. We both cried then, not the storm of the first night, but a small, weary thing that belonged to people who have had their private lives measured in evidence. No one told me how to feel about my son. Love does not evaporate because of betrayal. Betrayal does not wholly cancel love. It makes a ledger more complicated. I did what I could to be human. I sat beside him in a holding room and held his hand. He was a man still being shaped by fear. I was a woman with a box of papers and a letter from a dead husband that kept instructing me to be practical. Between the two of us there was an uneasy reconciliation in the presence of other watchers. The police moved with a measured patience I had not expected. They could not raid every clinic in a day. Systems move like glaciers sometimes, vast, inevitable, but slow. Investigators came to take copies of what we had and to ask questions that were less easy than they sounded. They had a registry, they said, of similar calls, and while they were cautious about promising anything, they were also not the kind of people who ignored a paper trail. In the following week, the story spread to other outlets. People called me a whistleblower. Others called me reckless. Some neighbors congratulated me with the strangeness of those who like drama from afar. The press brought vans and lights and men with notebooks who asked for interviews that made my mouth feel hollow. Katerina kept insisting we be measured in what we shared. Protect sources, name what is certain, let the evidence speak. There were threats, too. Anonymous emails, and a night where someone rattled the doorknob and left a single white rose on the steps. Not a gesture of tenderness, but a sign that someone wanted me to consider the price of insistence. The police took the rose as evidence. I kept it wrapped in tissue paper and carried it to Ricardo's grave. I did not speak aloud what I felt there, because the ground was a place for private truths. Vicente recovered slowly. He did not become a public figure because he did not want to. He preferred, and perhaps this was wisdom, the life of one who had saved his courage for necessary moments. But he did agree to speak to a prosecutor in private. He gave names, and the names made the ledger look less like a rumor and more like a plan. There was no hero's parade. There was a man who had been hurt, and who wanted, with a quiet humility, to put a few things right. The investigation moved forward in a way that was more procedural than glorious. Teams arrived to review records. Subpoenas were issued. There were nights when I sat awake worrying if the wheels would hold, if evidence would be allowed to breathe. But there were also mornings when people I had never met sent me messages of gratitude, or when a neighbor brought over a pie and said, "You did the right thing." I learned in those days how public pressure can act like weather. It makes people move. There were meetings where lawyers sat at long tables and argued over redactions, and over the proper sequence in which to release documents so that a judge could review them without becoming a spectator at a spectacle. Katerina negotiated headlines with an editor until they found a tone that was not bloodthirsty. She would not let the story be a feeding frenzy. She kept saying, "We are not here to punish. We are here to show." There was a day when men in suits who once seemed to glide through hallways with the confidence of occupants of a system sat in a courtroom and answered questions that were no longer private. There were depositions and sealed records and cautious yeses from people who had once been certain. I sat in the back of the gallery and held a sweater around my shoulders like armor. I did not expect relief to arrive all at once. I expected small, documented movements. Marcello agreed, in the end, to cooperate in ways that were painful to him. He gave statements to prosecutors describing names and times and the small arrangements he'd been part of. He did not plead innocence. He made room for truth. That made him smaller in one sense and larger in another. It was the shape of a man trying to be accountable. It was also the shape of a son I was trying to love without collapsing into the relief of denial. The public reaction was complex. Some people said that I had been brave in a way they would not be. Others asked why it had taken me so long. Some complained that the world was too quick to suspect institutions that provided care. I listened to voices and learned that truth rarely fits a single shape. My main task was not to answer every judgment, but to keep the record clear. It would be wrong to say that justice arrived all at once. Instead, it came like the slow unbuttoning of a shirt. There were hearings, a few quiet arrests of lower-level administrators, and an inquiry that would take months to untangle. People called it a scandal, and then wanted it contained. The press kept asking for names, for dramatic endpoints, for the kind of closure that makes television happy. We resisted easy narratives because easy narratives hide the strategic work of careful law. In the middle of all this, I found small acts that stitched my life back together. I began to call friends I had not spoken to in years, people I had pushed to the margins in the name of routine. I went to a small art exhibition at a gallery Ricardo liked and bought a painting with a horizon that was not the safe middle, but the uncertain edge. I took walks without purpose. I made a list, in a small notebook, of all the things I had deferred because I was waiting for a future that might never arrive. A trip to the coast, the audacity of learning to swim again, the chance to visit an old friend in the countryside. One night, after an exhausting day of meetings and giving interviews, I sat at the kitchen table and read Ricardo's letter again. The handwriting looked like a coiled thing. I read the line he had underlined twice. "Run if you must, but take the proof." I had run. I had taken the proof. The price had been complicated. The capture of Vicente, the complicity of my son in a system that preyed on his desperation, the quiet erosion of what I thought I had known about safety. But there was also the thing I had won, the possibility that others might be spared, or at least that the ledger would not lie drowned beneath comfortable corporate language. People began to ask me, with a mixture of curiosity and something else, what I had wasted when I heard the diagnosis. It was a question that seemed to search for a tidy list: years, money, youth. In truth, what I had wasted was slipperier. It was the hours I had allowed to be bargained away for comfort. It was the quiet agreement I had made with the world that being cautious was the same as being alive. I had, for years, deferred a braver taste of life because I assumed there would always be a later. I had saved things for the future the way a miser saves coins, forgetting that some wealth is lived and not banked. Yet, as I stood looking at the sea one morning, a small, much-delayed trip with a friend who had insisted I come, I realized that what I wasted could also be reclaimed. Wasted time is not always lost time if one decides to spend the rest with intention. The word waste includes a choice. I had been choosing small, safe things for too long because the idea of risk felt like danger. But risk is also the only language of living. That knowledge had come at a cost, but it remained knowledge. The legal apparatus would do what it would do. Men would argue in courtrooms and make small victories and losses that the public would pass like weather. People would be defended and accused. Names would appear in reports, and sometimes the weight of a ledger is less dramatic than one thinks. But I could control the way I spent the hours I had left. The morning I decided that, I woke before dawn and walked out into a light that felt like a promise rather than a chore. The city was softer than I had remembered. There were birds and someone sweeping a stoop 2 doors down, and the smell of warm bread. I made coffee and sat on the small balcony and felt the sunlight on my hands. The shoebox was in a drawer where it would not be trampled by the busy feet of investigators and journalists. The pen drive had been secured by a counsel for the paper. Copies had been lodged with authorities. The work had been done. There was still the slow mechanical business of court schedules and depositions, but the immediate danger had been diminished by exposure. I called Marcelo that morning and did not scold him. I asked him about the small details of his life that had nothing to do with fear. What he was eating, where he might sleep that night, if he had appointments scheduled. He spoke haltingly, and then, like a channel that had been closed and reopened, he began to talk. He said he wanted to make amends in ways he could, by telling the truth and by trying to pay what he could. I told him I would be present with him in that work, but I would not be his armor. His redemption would be his own. "What will you do now?" he asked at one point, that childish question that people ask when they are terrified. "I will live my days," I said. The words felt enormous and small at once. I will not let them write the end of my story. What I had wasted had not been totally lost. It was the years I let slip, assuming safety was a given. It was the afternoons I had postponed in the name of future security. It was trust granted without enough scrutiny. But those things could be reframed into commitments. I would not give my hours away to fear. I would speak when I suspected wrong. I would let my time be spent on things I loved, rather than stored as if tomorrow were a guaranteed relic. In the months that followed, the legal process moved through its patient, bureaucratic motions. There were hearings and some arrests at lower levels, and the clinic faced audits that left its corridors quieter than before. There was an investigator who called and said, "People are crediting you with the courage to get this moving," in a voice that sounded like respect. I did not feel heroic. I felt like someone who had finally chosen movement over stasis. The idea that one must always be ready to defend oneself hit me like a revelation. My life belonged to me, not to any ledger. There were no cinematic finales. There were, instead, years of paperwork and testimony, and the slow unpeeling of a network. People on television argued about ethics and oversight. Some of the criminal elements were still under investigation when the reporters wanted a neat wrap-up, and the lawyers wanted a careful patience. The narrative that had seemed poised to explode into a single verdict became properly a process. And I learned to live inside that process, to find the small joys between hearings, a meal with a friend, a drive by the river, a lazy afternoon with letters. I returned to the places I had been too cautious to visit before. I walked along the beach one afternoon and let the water come up to my ankles, a small act that felt like daring. I booked a ticket to a place Ricardo and I had always wanted to see. I learned to savor the light in the early hours and the way the city smelled after rain. These were not grand gestures. They were the steady accretion of a life reclaimed. On a quiet morning a year after the scrap of paper with the words, "She must not know," first tilted my world, I went to the graveyard with an envelope meant for Ricardo. I left my grief like a letter, and in return, I felt something like permission. It was then I could name clearly what I had finally understood I had wasted. Not only time and trust, but the naive assumption that systems always act in favor of the vulnerable. I had wasted the readiness to ask the hard questions sooner. I had wasted afternoons and conversations I deferred because I thought the future would wait. But I had also learned how to recover the squandered pieces. Waste can be reclaimed by intention. I would not get back those afternoons, but I could spend the ones ahead differently. I could love more loudly, ask more insistently, keep a sharper ledger of what mattered. There are days still when the weight of what we did presses down like a long shadow. There are nights when I think of Vicente's bruises and Marcelo's shame and the men who moved like shadows through bright corridors. There are days when I wonder if we did enough. Sometimes the guilt is a companion who refuses to leave the table. But then there is a letter from someone who writes to say simply, "I changed my mother's doctor after reading your story." And that small action feels like a seed planted in winter. The process continues. There are hearings scheduled beyond the horizon and depositions to come. People will argue in courtrooms that smell of old wood and legal precedent. I will go when I am asked, and I will speak when my counsel suggests it. But I will not let the entire shape of my life be defined by waiting rooms and diagnoses. The word the doctor used, 3 months, is still a thunderclap in my memory, but it no longer defines the measure of my life. I understand finally what I wasted. Not only minutes, but a habit of deferral, a kind of safety that belonged to a fiction. I have decided to spend the time they left me, not counting days, but filling them. If this story found you in a place where fear has become a coat you wear too often, tell me in the comments. What would you do? Subscribe to follow what happens next.